Hello, everyone. I'm going to get started in about another minute or so. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, thank you so much for coming to my breakout session, the Trans Experience, A Necessary Introduction to Theology Courses. My name is Sarah. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns, and I am a senior in college studying theology and political science. I'm particularly interested in queer theology, Christian ethics, and political theology. And I'm on the very beginning of my journey as a queer Christian and as an academic. This is my first conference presentation, and I'm just really excited and grateful to be here with all of you today. I do just want to say as a start, this presentation is mostly from a Catholic perspective, as even though I myself am not Catholic, that's been the majority of my schooling, and that's what the majority of my classes focus on. So I'd love to hear, if you're interested, in the chat or afterwards, what your experiences with this have been as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So first, I'm going to begin with an opening prayer. I'm going to read a poem by Mary Oliver called I Happen to Be Standing. I don't know where prayers go or what they do. Do cats pray when they sleep half asleep in the sun? Does the opossum pray as it crosses the street? The sunflowers, the old black oak growing older every year. I know I can walk through the world, along the shore or under the trees, with my mind filled with things of little importance in full self-attendance, a condition I can't really call being alive. Is a prayer a gift or a petition, or does it matter? The sunflowers blaze, maybe it's their way. Maybe the cats are sound asleep, maybe not. While I was thinking this, I happened to be standing just outside my door with my notebook open, which is the way I begin every morning. Then a wren in the privé began to sing. He was positively drenched in enthusiasm. I don't know why, and yet why not? I wouldn't persuade you from whatever you believe or whatever you don't. That's your business. But I thought of the wren singing. What could this be if it isn't a prayer? So I just listened, my pen in the air. So to give you some background as to this presentation, this stems from a class that I led as part of being a teaching assistant for a course at my university called Theo 100, which is a class that every undergraduate is required to take, introducing them to Christian theology. And the class that I taught for this was on the topic theologies of embodiment. So basically focusing on the long history of tension in Christianity between the body and the spirit. We focused on an article by a trans Christian named Jacob Hero about how he formulated a queer theology of flourishing out of his experience with medically transitioning. And my experience with leading this class discussion was that this seemed to be a very new way of thinking for the vast majority of the students, and they clearly seemed very challenged and interested by the topic. So this pushed me to further explore why this topic should be integrated into introductory theology courses. So my goals for this presentation are to present an overview of both the challenges and the potential of integrating trans topics into the college theology classroom in the hopes of beginning to reflect on greater pathways to inclusion. So before I begin my presentation, I just want to give some basic terminology just to make sure we're all on the same page when I use these terms later in the presentation. I first want to make it clear that there is no universal trans experience. For every trans person, there's a different experience of gender. But in this presentation, I will be using trans as an umbrella term which will include non-binary, gender expansive, gender fluid, and genderqueer individuals. Now, some key terms to know, as defined by PFLAG, are transgender, which is a term describing a person's gender identity that does not necessarily match their assigned sex at birth. Non-binary, which refers to people who do not subscribe to the gender binary. Gender identity, which is a person's deeply held core sense of self in relation to gender, which does not always correspond to their biological sex. And then biological sex is the anatomical, physiological, genetic, or physical attributes that determine if a person is male, female, or intersex. So again, words are constantly changing and shifting, and they're always inherently limiting. So even though these won't perfectly reflect the diversities of people's experiences of gender and sex, they're still helpful ways to move forward in thinking about this topic. So I think it's important to give some background first of the broader world that's influencing the classroom that we enter into and teach in at this moment in time. 2021 was the worst year on record for anti-transgender legislation. As of December 2021, over 100 bills had been introduced in state legislatures compared to 79 in all of 2020. So unfortunately, this only seems to be an upward rising trend. Now, all of this, however, is occurring at the same time as the attempted passage of the Equality Act in Congress. So this act would make it illegal to discriminate against someone based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. While this has been passed by the Democratic majority House, it has been stalled in the Senate. As of December 27, 2021, there hasn't been any progress. And this act has been heavily opposed by groups that are committed to protecting religious freedom. So alongside this, there are also similar trends that are happening in Christian spaces currently. Most recently, Christian groups have been very split over the passage of the Equality Act. Both the National Association of Evangelicals and the Conference of Catholic Bishops have released public opposition to the bill, yet many mainline Protestant groups have expressed support. So there's currently a very split division between these different groups and their views on political inclusion for LGBTQ people. At the same time, there are currently 33 LGBTQ students who are suing the Department of Education over discrimination that they have faced at federally funded Christian colleges. This lawsuit, called Elizabeth Hunter v. US Department of Education, is being brought by REAP, or the Religious Exemption Accountability Project, and they hope to assert the fundamental rights of LGBTQ students and prevent further abuse at religious colleges. Now, this lawsuit was launched on March 30th, 2021. In June of that same year, the Department of Justice said that they would defend the religious colleges and universities named in the lawsuit. And this, unfortunately, seems to be the last update on the matter. The case has not yet been resolved. Now, another thing that really shapes my experience going to a Catholic college and teaching in a Catholic college is a document entitled Male and Female, He Created Them. And this document was released by the Catholic Church, who is actively trying to shape how trans topics are discussed in classrooms around the world. So this letter was released specifically by the Vatican's Congregation for Catholic Education in 2019. And it's meant to counter what they call gender theory, which they define as teachings that deny the different bodies and natures of men and women. And like I said before, this has a huge impact on the classroom, as it's meant to guide all parents, students, school leaders and personnel, bishops, priests, and religious, aka any Catholic who might be involved in some way with the educational environment of children. So some of the major points in this document, it's important to point out, considering that this is meant to influence what happens in the classroom regarding trans topics, is that a person's identity is not a choice. There's a heavy focus on traditional ideas of Christian anthropology. So this sees God as having only created men and women, and the differences between men and women are very heavily emphasized. So of course, this does not leave much room for trans people or perspectives or for any notions of gender fluidity. It's important to note as well that a new document basically reinforcing this view was released in the past week by the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, called Catechesis and Policy on Questions Concerning Gender Theory. This document basically reinforces all the points laid out in Male and Female, He Created Them, but it takes it further by moving from the realm of education to all of Catholic parish life in Milwaukee. And this document says that children should not be allowed to share their pronouns, along with many other examples of things that will be forbidden under this document. So again, this seems to be a huge obstacle to trans inclusion in the classroom if the Catholic Church is actively working to address trans topics in this very limited, specific, and discriminatory way. Now, what is the impact of both political policy, religious policy on trans individuals in the United States? A 2019 study out of the Yale School of Public Health found that trans individuals have a very high risk of mental illness compared to the general public. They are 6 times more likely to have a mood or anxiety disorder, and 3 times as likely to be prescribed antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication. And there's also, unfortunately, a skyrocketing trend of violence against trans people in the United States. Human Rights Campaign tracks fatal violence against trans people each year. 2020 had at least 44 fatalities, which is almost certainly an undercount, which was the highest number since they began tracking in 2013. This record was broken again in 2021, and it seems to be on track to be broken again this year. And the vast majority of this violence is against trans women of color. So the cultural landscape and the religious landscape undoubtedly seem very grim. It would be understandable to question whether there even is a way to move forward with bringing trans people into the theology classroom, given these factors. However, I would like to believe that there is a way that this can be resolved, and we can move toward a more nuanced approach that allows trans people and trans topics to be broached in Christian theology classrooms. So first, it's important to understand that a lot of common topics that I have seen taught in the theology classroom, both as a student and as a teaching assistant, really do seem like stumbling blocks to trans inclusion at first sight. And it's important to address these because these topics almost certainly will come up in introductory courses. So first, dualisms are a huge part of Christian thought. And this is basically any philosophical idea that deals in oppositions or the idea of either or. So, some examples of this would be heaven and hell, good and evil, anything that seems to be extremely opposed and very black and white. Now, it's not hard to see how this philosophical idea that shows up so frequently in Christian theology can also lead to ideas that there are two opposing sexes, two opposing genders, a very either or mentality that does not leave much room for gender fluidity. Additionally, gender complementarity is a huge part of Christian theology, especially Catholic. Um, and these are ideas that highlight the differences between men and women, the different responsibilities, roles, and personality characteristics that they supposedly have. And of course, if you're looking at this very binary way of viewing men and women, this leaves little room for trans people or for gender fluidity. This is seen in many Catholic documents, such as Letter to Families by Pope John Paul II and Amoris Laetitia, which was a recent document by Pope Francis. So it's spanning a long period of time in Catholic thought. I'd like to read a passage that gives a better idea of this from the document we discussed earlier, Men and Woman, He Created Them. And this passage reads, a further positive development in anthropological understanding, also present in writing on gender, has centered on the values of femininity. Women have a unique understanding of reality. They possess a capacity to endure adversity and to keep life going, even in extreme situation. This helps explain why, wherever the work of education is called for, we can note that women are ever ready and willing to give themselves generously to others, especially in serving the weakest and most defenseless. In this work, they exhibit a kind of effective, cultural, and spiritual motherhood, which has inestimable value for the development of individuals and the future of society. So, clearly, this gives an extremely fixed view of what it means to be a woman. Here it's defined as being concerned with education, having a very specific view of the world, raising children. And the subtext is that this is in contrast to what it means to be a man. So, again, anytime there's these very opposed definitions of gender and sex, that doesn't leave very much room for trans, gender fluid, non-binary individuals. And then finally, there's this very famous passage in the Bible that is often used as the foundation of Christian anthropology or what it means to be a human in the Christian tradition. And this reads from Genesis, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So this is central to the Catholic vision and the broader Christian vision of who human beings are. And some people read this passage as saying that God only created men and women, and that this is the only way to be a human. And this is often used to exclude trans people, gender fluid people from the conversation. Now, luckily, Christian theology doesn't teach one position on anything, on any topic, and there's never one way to look at any source. Alternative perspectives are also found in common documents like the Bible and Catholic social teaching that provide a much better lens through which to welcome trans people and perspectives into the theology classroom. And these are already sources that are probably being used in theology classrooms and being brought up in conversations that give a very different view on possibilities for trans inclusion. So, going back to the Bible, in contrast to the passage from Genesis, which is often used to exclude trans people from conversations in the church, there are also perspectives in the Bible that seem to be more open to trans inclusion and to provide that possibility. A particular instance of this is a passage from Acts chapter 8, verses 26 to 40, which is the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. And I will read that passage now. An angel from the Lord spoke to Philip. At noon, take the road that leads from Jerusalem to Gaza. So he did. Meanwhile, an Ethiopian man was on his way home from Jerusalem, where he had come to worship. He was a eunuch and an official responsible for the entire treasury of Candace. He was reading the prophet Isaiah while sitting in his carriage. The Spirit told Philip, "Approach this carriage and stay with it." Running up to the carriage, Philip heard the man reading the prophet Isaiah. He asked, "Do you really understand what you are reading?" The man replied, "Without someone to guide me, how could I?" Then he invited Philip to climb up and sit with him. This was the passage of scripture he was reading. Like a sheep, he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb from its shearer is silent, so he didn't open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was taken away from him. Who can tell the story of his descendants, because his life was taken from the earth? The eunuch asked Philip, "Tell me, about whom does this prophet say this? Is he talking about himself or someone else?" Starting with that passage, Philip proclaimed the good news about Jesus to him. As they went down the road, they came to some water. The eunuch said, "Look, water. What would keep me from being baptized?" He ordered that the carriage halt. Both Philip and the eunuch went down to the water, where Philip baptized him. When they came up out of the water, the Lord's Spirit suddenly took Philip away. The eunuch never saw him again, but went on his way rejoicing. So, overall, this is a story of an Ethiopian eunuch who asked Philip, a disciple of Jesus, to baptize him. Now, a eunuch in the time of the Bible was traditionally defined as a castrated male. So this would be someone who defies the traditional sex binary. And it's important to note that the eunuch has agency in this situation. He asks to be baptized, and Philip immediately complies with his desires with no hesitation or questioning. According to scholar Emma Percy, she says it's important to note that the baptism of this person who does not easily fall within the gender binary was never for a moment debated, that Philip immediately complies. And this has very liberatory possibilities for trans people. If we see an instance of someone who does not fit within the traditional gender or sex binary being immediately baptized and welcomed by a disciple of Jesus, then this seems to imply that the same would be true for trans non-binary individuals today. And that's a very different biblical passage than what we saw earlier with traditional readings of Genesis. Another famous passage that seems to add some more nuance is Psalm 139, which is a very famous passage, but I will read a short part of it nonetheless. "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book, before one of them came to be." So this passage seems to imply that God makes every person and creates them uniquely and individually to be exactly the way they are. And if this applied to everyone, it would also apply to trans and non-binary individuals. God knew exactly what God was doing in creating trans people, and this was an intentional and loving act. Now, another topic that comes up frequently in introductory theology classrooms besides the Bible is also Catholic social teaching, especially in Catholic high school and college environments like the ones I have gone to school in. And many of these teachings from Catholic social teaching, again, open up way more liberatory and nuanced perspectives that allow for trans topics and people to be brought into the classroom. So a first example of this is the principle life and dignity of the human person. And all of these passages that I'm going to read are from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. So the life and dignity of the human person teaches that the Catholic Church proclaims that human life is sacred and that the dignity of the human person is the foundation of a moral vision for society. This belief is the foundation of all the principles of our social teaching. Now, if this is the case, then all lives are equally sacred. And though this is usually cited as a reason for the church's opposition to abortion, the death penalty, other practices like that, it also implies that all people, including trans, gender fluid, non-binary people, are equally sacred and that everyone's dignity matters equally. Additionally, a second principle is call to family, community, and participation, and the church defines this as how we organize our society in economics and politics, in law and policy, directly affects human dignity and the capacity of individuals to grow in community. We believe that people have a right and a duty to participate in society, seeking together the common good and well-being of all, especially the poor and the vulnerable. Now, this teaches that all people have a right to participate fully in society. Currently, trans people do not have this due to the constant threat of violence, discriminatory laws, etc. So based on this principle, we would need to change society. We have a calling to change society, rather, to better include trans individuals and to honor their human dignity. A third principle in Catholic social teaching is rights and responsibilities. And this basically teaches that every person has a right and a duty to participate in society and to seek the common good and well-being of all. Um, This is similar to call to family, community, and participation and life and dignity of the human person. But basically, if all people have a right to life and decency, then we have a responsibility to also provide that to trans people. Perhaps the most liberatory possibility comes with the option for the poor and the vulnerable, which states that a basic moral test of how our most vulnerable members are faring in a society marred by deepening divisions between rich and poor is to instruct us to put the needs of the poor and the vulnerable first. So if, as Catholic teaching states, we need to put the poor and the vulnerable first, trans people, particularly trans people of color, are some of the most marginalized in our society based on the laws targeting them, based on the violence that seems to be ever growing against trans people. An option for the poor and the vulnerable would specifically prioritize trans perspectives. Finally, in terms of solidarity, this states that we are one human family, whether our national, racial, ethnic, economic, and ideological differences. We are brothers and sisters keepers wherever they may be. Loving our neighbor has global dimensions in a shrinking world. Our love for all sisters and brothers demands that we promote peace in a world surrounded by violence and conflict. So while it's important to note that this definition does not mention gender or sexual differences, and it also uses the gendered language of sisters and brothers, it's still a very radical message that pushes for us to promote peace for all people, regardless of our differences, and this would certainly include trans and non-binary individuals. So in short, most of the principles of Catholic social teaching support greater respect and inclusion for the trans community. Obviously, this is the same Catholic Church that put out the document, Men and Women, He Created Them, but the point is to show that alternative perspectives can and do exist, and that inclusion can be found in the same materials generally used to reject and exclude trans people from Christian spaces and classrooms. So now I would like to show a video about a Catholic nun who is using the principles of Catholic social teaching to specifically justify her work and as the mission behind her work to minister to trans individuals. And as you'll see in this video, she uses the language of human dignity, option for the poor and the vulnerable, and call to family, community, and participation to discuss why she does this work in the first place.
I am absolutely meant by God to be a companion to transgender people and reflect to them their goodness and their beauty. There is a narrative out there that says transgender people really don't exist. I'm here to tell you they exist, and they have a right to be treated with dignity and respect. When I began to do this ministry in 1999, I needed to be visible to those who needed me, but I needed to be hidden to those who could compromise what I was doing. I used Sister Monica as a pseudonym for all the years that I was doing this ministry. It got harder and harder every year for me to hide. So in 2018, I decided I have to use my own name. Once the clarity came from God that now is the time to stand up and use my name and be me and be visible the way I encourage transgender people to do, I experienced a profound inner freedom. There needs to be legislation that protects the common good of all people, particularly marginalized people, and from my perspective, transgender people. And I tell them all the time, when you look at me, I want you to see God's love looking at you. And when I see you, I see God looking at me with love.
All right, so again, this video really shows how Catholic social teaching has liberatory possibilities, and that it can be used directly to better include trans people in the Christian, particularly Catholic conversation. So another important thing to note is what the science says about trans people. And you may ask why I bring science into a conversation about faith. Well, it's because some Christian churches, and in particular the Catholic Church, has in recent decades taken many pro-science positions, and it advocates for the honoring of both faith and reason in the pursuit of knowledge. Additionally, science is also taught in schools alongside theology, so this knowledge should ideally inform the other. So, it's important to note that neither gender nor sex is a binary. Gender is the socially constructed expectations about what it means to be a man or a woman, and sex are biological markers that are used to denote whether someone is male or female. Now, according to Nature magazine, up to 1 in 100 female based on these simple biological markers. Additionally, intersex children do exist, even if doctors often arbitrarily choose a gender or sex for people in their youth. Pope Francis, the current Catholic Pope, has shown his respect for science through documents such as Laudato Si, and many other modern Catholic Church documents also show great respect for science in their position. A document was released by the Canadian Conference for Catholic Bishops in 2019. It's called Science in Catholic Faith, And this document states that reason is an integral part of the Catholic intellectual tradition. The Church sees the relationship between science and faith as one of complementarity and mutual stimulus, aka these different disciplines can inform the others. And then finally, the Catechism of the Catholic Church also notes that research in all branches of knowledge can never conflict with faith because the things of this world and the things of faith derive from the same God. So basically, this document is saying that faith and reason are not opposed. So why then can't the Catholic Church read and respect the science on this too? It seems like churches are choosing to accept science when it fits with their perspectives and ignore it when it does not. And this again just shows a lot of the nuance in these positions that the church takes. There's often positions that seem to directly contradict or at least add some nuance that would allow for trans people to be better included. So it's also important to note that the document that we discussed earlier, Men and Women, He Created Them, is not a perfect document, as no document is. And even though it is meant to inform Catholic education, it has many, I guess, drawbacks or pitfalls that make it perhaps not the document that should be used to completely guide the conversation. So this document claims that its goal is to listen and to foster dialogue and to get to the heart of respecting human dignity. Yet it uses many outdated terms that for many trans people would not authentically describe their experience. These are terms like gender theory rather than calling people trans people or non-binary people, and terms like sexual tendencies, which show that the church is not listening to the actual lived experiences of trans people. Additionally, there's a conflation of sex and gender. This document seems to suggest that they are the same thing. Yet the church also states that it respects science and social sciences, so these two positions seem to directly contradict. Additionally, this document gives a very one-dimensional reading of that passage in Genesis that we discussed earlier, saying that God created man in his own image, male and female, he created them. The Bible does not have one position on creation, and this is not mentioned in the document, but there also exists a second creation story in Genesis, and this passage reads, "This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, when the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. Now no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up. For the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams came up from the earth, and watered the whole surface of the ground. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." This is generally considered the story of the creation of Adam and then later Eve, but there's a piece from Shiloh Rossborough and also other Christian scholars that suggests that if one human is created in this other version of Genesis, rather than male and female, and this person is meant to be the image of God, who is genderless, then this first person could probably be described as genderqueer, non-binary, someone in the trans umbrella. And if Eve comes from Adam, Eve must have first been part of Adam. So again, these genders were sort of mixed up and combined in this first person. This is all just to say that one-dimensional reading of Genesis that is presented in this document is not the only position on Genesis that exists in Christian scholarship, in the Bible, in Christian theology more broadly. Perhaps most importantly, this document claims that it does not want to discriminate or to disrespect trans people, but it also claims that trans people do not exist. Rather, they are just people that subscribe to an ideology. Minimizing trans people's experiences to gender theory shows a failure to actually take seriously the lived experiences of trans people. And ultimately, this is going to be a recurring problem in this presentation. The fact that many traditional sources for Christian theology or regarding trans people in Christian theology don't actually talk to trans people or listen to their experiences or listen to their theology. And that, I think, is a fatal flaw that needs to be taken very seriously. And this gives credence to the perspective that there is no one right, innate Christian perspective on trans people. So, what overall is the reality of Christianity then, now that we've looked at some of the stumbling blocks to trans inclusion, as well as some of the potential pathways for greater inclusion? The Bible is very nuanced and complex. There is not one position on any topic that is presented in the Bible. So far, we have seen many stumbling blocks to trans inclusion in Christian theology, but there's also lots of ways to move forward with greater nuance and possibility. Additionally, the modern concept of transgender did not exist in the biblical era. So, how could it have been properly addressed by the text? Uh, Christian ethics approaches modern topics by exploring scripture, tradition, reason, and experience to make informed ethical decisions about modern topics like trans inclusion and LGBTQ rights. Honoring experience as a valid site of theological reflection, in particular, provides a very promising pathway toward greater trans inclusion in the theology classroom. So now I'd like to move from more of the scholarly perspective, the Christian theology perspective on ways to address trans topics to my own lived experience in the classroom. So I served as a teaching assistant in spring of 2021 for, again, the required class at my university, Introduction to Christian Theology. And the topic that I taught was theologies of embodiment. In order to prepare for this class, students had to complete Bible readings concerning the body, read excerpts from St. Augustine's Confessions, and also this article I discussed earlier by Jacob Hero, a trans Christian activist and pastor. So this class, the goal was to show the complexity of Christian views on the body and on embodiment by providing a wide variety of perspectives, again, to show this nuance that exists in the Christian tradition about this topic. For example, for some of the Bible readings that were assigned, Matthew chapter 26, verse 41 says that the spirit is strong while the body is weak. Well, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24 says that Jesus freed us from our sins using his body on the cross. So already there, we see two very different perspectives on the body, one saying it's weak in comparison to the spirit, one noting that Jesus's physical body was a key part of Christian salvation. In Augustine's Confessions, we see a man who is extremely troubled by his own embodiment. He talks about being tempted by hunger, thirst, sex, other parts of his bodily experience, and he thinks that all physical activities must be oriented toward God in order to be acceptable. So this is a man who is clearly very much struggling with his own embodiment. And then I will discuss exactly what the Hero article talked about later in this presentation. This class was a wide mix of individuals. Many people in this class did come from Catholic backgrounds or from Catholic schools, but many people also identified as agnostic or atheists and were simply had very little orientation with Christian theology or had actively decided to move away from it, there were also many queer people in this class who could bring more of a lived experience perspective to this topic. I asked students to reflect on these three main questions as they were going through this reading, in the hopes that they would come to class ready to discuss a lot of these nuances about the topic. These questions were: what are the limitations of traditional notions of Christian embodiment when considering the experiences of trans people? Is the spirit always more important than the body in a Christian context, or can the body also play an important role in a Christian life? And then finally, what is unique about transgender embodiment, according to Hero's article, and what can it teach us about human flourishing, human dignity, and creation? So, to summarize this article that formed sort of the crux of this class, it was by, again, Jacob Hero, who's a trans activist and Christian pastor, and the article was called Toward a Queer Theology of Flourishing. So here starts this article by discussing the difficulties of his transition process, how he had to lie in order to access hormones, and how this violated his values and his sense of agency and of human dignity. So, out of this experience, he is seeking to find a queer theology of flourishing that allows trans people to live in line with their values and to have agency. Um, he ultimately, through this article, begins to see his medical transition as allowing him to engage in the co-creative process with God. So trans people are often seen as violating the natural laws of creation. We see that through traditional interpretations of Genesis. Um, but he's instead proposing that trans people are being called to embody their self more authentically by participating in the creative process with God. And he says that rather than going against creation, trans medically allowed him to become more fully himself by participating in the ongoing work of creation. He felt that this queer theology of flourishing recognized his human dignity more, and he talks a lot about his top surgery, which he felt affirmed this dignity by again allowing him to live the life that he was called to live. Even if he may have felt some shame in the intense vulnerability of this surgery, it ultimately affirmed his dignity as a human and his dignity as a trans person by again calling him to be the more authentic version of himself that God is calling all of us to be. So obviously, this is a perspective that is not often taught in Christian theology courses. So I was very interested to see what the students' reactions would be to this material. And I was shocked by the amount of participation and respectful questions that I received in response to this conversation. Now, part of this may have been the excitement of having a new teacher who brought a new perspective to the classroom and was not our usual professor. But I think genuinely much of the excitement was because people had never heard of this topic before in Christian theology courses. It was something that was never discussed, never brought up. And if it was brought up, it was in the negative ways that we saw discussed at the beginning of this presentation. Importantly, many students mentioned that they had no idea that trans people could even be Christians. So my hope is that even if people's opinions on trans rights, LGBTQ inclusion in society and in Christian spaces did not totally change, I hope that by knowing that trans people can hold deep faith and participate deeply in Christian theological reflection, that this pushed them to at least add nuance to and to reconsider their previously held beliefs about Christian theology. So, because I am at the very beginning of my educational journey and in my experience as an academic and as a teacher, it's important to note that it's not just me trying to figure out how to integrate trans topics better into the classroom. There are a wide range of academics with far more experience than me who are working to better uncover the best ways to integrate this topic into their courses. Now, none of these academics experiences perfectly align with the classroom experience that I was a part of, but all of them offer some helpful points to consider when trying to integrate trans voices into the curriculum. So the first article that I want to discuss is an article by Nicholas Clarkson, and this article discusses his experiences as a trans man teaching women's studies, gender studies courses at various universities. And he is giving an overview of what he sees as the major sticking points in teaching trans students at universities. Now, obviously, the limitation here is he was teaching women's studies courses where I'm focused more on theology courses, but I still think his points are important. He thinks that you should not teach trans topics through a trans day or a trans week, as he writes, because this others trans people by making them not an integrated part of the curriculum, but as a topic that is set apart from the others. And I think that this may have been a pitfall of my contribution to my course, is that we really only talked about um, trans people in this one subject, theologies of embodiment. Now, it may not be possible to integrate trans people into every theological conversation, but I could definitely find more or trans scholars to bring to the conversation on topics like aesthetics or creation. The next article that I would like to discuss is by Martino and Potvin, and a brief summary of this article is that they interviewed 3 elementary school teachers in Australia and 8 elementary school teachers in Canada to learn more about how they approached using resources that depicted either same-sex parenting and relationships or gender nonconformity / trans children and people. And they particularly focused on the case study of Janice, who's a 51-year-old teacher in Ontario, to show how she approached this topic in the classroom. Now, again, this is limited because it discusses elementary school students, whereas I am mostly focusing on college students, but I still think they make some really good points. They emphasize the importance of contextualizing queer and trans topics in the classroom, so similar to Clarkson, rather than dropping all of this information about trans people on one day, you can build it in small pieces throughout the curriculum so that students are continuously thinking about the topic. Also, they note that it's not just about merely adding trans voices to curriculum, but finding ways more broadly to open people up to greater imagination. And this mirrors my own experience in the classroom, in that besides reading most people never having read a source, a Christian source about trans people, a lot of people didn't even know trans people could be Christian. So that and had never met one before. So I think inherently this opened up a lot of people's imaginations and their sense of creativity toward the topic. It's also important to note that the teacher involved in this study frequently discussed how careful she had to be in bringing up the topics regarding trans people and queer people because of religiously based homophobia in her community. And this shows how fear and vulnerability can impact pedagogy, and I will come back to this topic later. Finally, I want to talk a bit about Keenan's article, and he is drawing on his experience as a queer and trans elementary school teacher to develop a critical trans pedagogy. He notes the role that schooling often plays in establishing the norm of heterosexuality. So peers and teachers often inadvertently or purposefully teach queer people to dislike themselves or think that they're not normal. The limits here again, he's focusing on teaching elementary school students while I'm focused more on college students. But I think his talk about allowing room for experiential inquiry, allowing students possibility to explore, ask questions about experiences they've had, and experiment with differences relates a lot to my experience. I think after reading this article by Hero in the classroom, students seem to be questioning a lot why they'd never heard of trans Christians before and what that meant about theology and about the limits of their own experiences with Christian theology. And I think that that was probably the most fulfilling part of my experience, was seeing people start to ask themselves these questions that they had never considered before. So overall, why do I think we need more theological literacy regarding the trans experience? I think that a major role is that it liberates us from more negative notions of the body in Christian tradition. A lot of times, as I talked about and as the students explored in this class, in the introductory material, the Bible and things like Augustine's Confessions often present the body as something to struggle against and something that is not as important to being human as the spirit. But the experience of trans people reminds us that we are fully embodied and that our bodies matter greatly to our ability to be fulfilled, to be vulnerable, and to be authentic. Um, Hero talks about this a lot in his article, talking about how his top surgery made him able to be a more authentic version of himself and to feel closer to God through that process. And it reminds us that Jesus was embodied. He came to earth in the form of a human, and his embodiment mattered. And I think trans people can help remind us that our bodies do matter in becoming close to God and more authentically ourselves. And then finally, political and religious alienation have very severe consequences for trans individuals, as I discussed earlier. Um, Nearly 80% of trans and non-binary teenagers have reported suicide attempts. And again, as I discussed earlier, there's a very high and growing murder rate against trans people, especially trans women of color. If, as seems to be a very common theme in Christian theology, we are called to care deeply about the life and the dignity and the rights of all persons, then we have to prevent this violence and hatred from growing. And I think a very important way to do this is to bring trans topics into Christian theology classrooms to show that trans people do exist in Christian spaces and to normalize this conversation. Now, I also want to note a lot of the limitations of my own experience teaching this topic. I have a lot of privilege as a white student at a liberal Catholic college, and I was also TAing for a professor who was very on board with me bringing trans perspectives into the classroom. She's very queer affirming, and that is not the experience of a lot of people. I probably would not have felt as safe if I had done this in a different space as a different person. And it's also important to point out that there's a real fear of retribution of bringing up trans topics in the classroom at many Christian institutions. In the Wayne and Cumming Potvin article that I discussed earlier, it's important to note that the teacher they focused on was a lesbian woman who was trying to integrate genderqueer materials into her classroom. Many religious groups in her community were very vocally opposed to her doing this, and children were ultimately allowed to opt out of this conversation. So this teacher ended up feeling very hypervigilant about self-disclosure. She felt like she would be discredited or monitored if parents ended up finding out that she was queer. And this fear and sense of vulnerability about her identity in the classroom really impacted her ability to teach these topics, often in response to pushback from religious groups. I should also note that the students in my class did not know that I was queer and non-binary, and I think that maybe if I had shared that, that would have made me more vulnerable, and I would have felt far more fearful going into this conversation. And this is a real limit to pedagogical approaches. Additionally, there's a lot of instances of LGBTQ educators being fired from Catholic institutions. It's a relatively frequent occurrence, and there only seem to be 2 or so instances where a teacher who was fired for their sexuality or gender was later reinstated. And courts are generally pretty lenient on Catholic schools when it comes to anti-discrimination laws due to notions of religious freedom. So employees who are fired unfortunately have little legal recourse. So educators may not want to bring up trans topics or LGBTQ topics in the classroom, or to note that they themselves are part of that community, because that could have real implications, negative implications on their career and on their lives. Finally, the document Male and Female, He Created Them. Fortunately, this is meant to be a guide to for Catholic schools, Catholic institutions, and it explicitly states that trans topics should never be taught in the classroom and should be shut down, and that trans people should not be validated or considered real, even. And again, because this is meant to be a guiding document, this has real impacts on what teachers feel comfortable with sharing, or even what's allowed to be shared in many school contexts. And the way that they put this in the document reads as follows: the autonomy and freedom of teaching is recognized today in many legal systems. In such a context, schools can collaborate with Catholic institutes of higher education to develop a deepened understanding of the various aspects of education and sexuality, with the further aim of creating new teaching materials, pedagogic reference works, and teaching manuals that are based on the Christian vision of man and woman. So again, the Vatican is actively encouraging schools to find ways to incorporate anti-trans material into the curriculum rather than what I am proposing. And this is unfortunately a real limitation. So with all of this considered, what can theology teachers do? Now, this is based on my own very limited experiences. These are only some possibilities that I noted, and I hope that you can spend time reflecting on what you think theology teachers might be able to do to better include trans people in the curriculum going forward. So first, I think it's important for theology teachers to present all sides of the biblical narrative. Yes, the phrase male and female, he created them, does exist in Genesis, but so do individuals who challenge the gender binary, like the story of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts. The Bible is complex. It is not one-sided. And I think that by presenting that in the classroom, it opens up more possibilities to trans inclusion, rather than the one-sided narrative that's seen in that passage from Genesis. Additionally, the concept of imago Dei, or image of God, I think is very important. This idea is that all people are truly made in the image of God. And if this is true, why would God have not also have created trans people in their image? This is a very fundamental Catholic idea, Christian idea, and I think that it's often not explored for its radical and its inclusive possibilities. Not finally, third, I think that it's important for teachers to explore the radical possibilities of Catholic social teaching, as I discussed earlier. Um, thinking about principles like prioritizing the poor and vulnerable. Trans people in the US are some of the most vulnerable people to legal discrimination and violence. And if all people have fundamental dignity, as Catholic social teaching states, then trans people's dignity needs to also be affirmed and lifted up and even prioritized in this framework. And then finally, I think it's really important for trans Christian perspectives to be centered and read in the theology classroom. There are many prominent trans Christian scholars nowadays, including Hero, who we discussed in my class. And when I led the discussion, that seemed to be students' favorite part of the class, hearing from an actual trans Christian, as many students did not know that queer or trans Christians existed, and they really didn't know any of these people personally. So it really helped them open their minds and their perspectives to hear firsthand how transitioning helped Hero explore his flourishing as a Christian. And I think I want to emphasize that this has been, in my opinion, one of the greatest failures of Christian theological approaches to trans people so far, is that it fails to take seriously the actual lived experience of trans people. And I want to end with some quotes from that were in response to the release of the document Male and Female He Created Them when it came out in 2019, obviously having very negative ramifications for trying to include trans people in the classroom. So a quote from Marianne Duddy Burke, the executive director of Dignity USA, reads as follows: "This document fundamentally disregards and disrespects LGBTQ people by claiming our gender identity and sexual orientation are simply choices. It denies the truth of our experience of gender and sexuality as innate, God-given blessings. The Vatican's stubborn refusal to reconsider its stale vision of gender complementarity as the exclusive basis for human identity and relationships in the light of decades of contrary scientific findings and personal testimony from millions is tragic." So here, Duddy Burke is basically summarizing most of what I talked about in this presentation. A lot of traditional Christian perspectives just don't even consider the lived experiences of trans people, and this leads them to really disregard their dignity, and just ignore science and reason and many other things that suggest trans people need to be better included. Additionally, a quote from Father James Martin, who's a Jesuit priest famous for his ministry work with LGBTQ people, reacted to this document as follows: "Sadly, it will be used as a cudgel against transgender people and an excuse to argue that they shouldn't even exist. The document is mainly a dialogue with philosophers and theologians and with other church documents, but not with scientists and biologists, not with psychologists, and certainly not with LGBTQ people, whose experiences are given little, if any, weight." Again, this simply reinforces the point that extremely often trans voices and perspectives are not being taken into consideration at all in this discussion, and that is to the detriment of trans inclusion in the future. So I would like to end with a reflection activity, um, asking you to consider a few questions that might help you consider how you can contribute to including trans people in educational environments, or even just reflecting on your own experience with this topic going forward. Um, so I would encourage you to think about, what were you taught about the body in school and in Christian educational environments growing up? How were LGBTQ people addressed in the classroom and in Christian spaces, if at all? Have you had positive experiences with discussions of LGBTQ topics in school or in Christian spaces? And then in what roles in your own lives do you educate others? How can you bring trans people and topics into the conversation? So again, these are just some questions to consider moving forward after this presentation as you go back into your own lives and continue to reflect and think about this work. And yes, I would love to open this up to Q&A if anyone would like to contribute to this conversation.
So my name is Joseph. I'm the moderator. If anyone has a question, just let me know. I can kind of pull this out of webinar mode and let individuals ask questions directly to Sarah. So any takers or thoughts on the reflection? Actually, Sarah, do you want to put the questions back up?
Yes, sorry.
No, no worries.
I don't know why it did that.
Habit.
I can just start by sharing my own experience. I know that, you know, being queer and non-binary and going to a Catholic high school, I would have never heard anything about trans people except in a negative light. And I think going to college and going to a liberal Catholic school and beginning to hear about some of these more nuanced perspectives really was like liberatory for me as a queer Christian, and really allowed me to begin to explore my own faith more deeply, and I feel become more excited about learning theology. So it's really transformational for me.
I think River Coyote has their hand up, and your River, you are up.
Oh, thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, great job. Thank you for putting this together for us. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm gender fluid and queer, and I've been out as a queer person for 26 years or something like that, but came out as non-binary in 2020 when, you know, all that time at home. So that's been new for me. So I think in terms of like educating people in my personal life, so I didn't get to see this kind of thing in college. It was never talked about through my college years. Even when I went back to school and got my master's, I don't even know in public health, I don't know if they covered trans issues at all. But so it's mostly been more of a personal, you know, share, and like, so I think like it's relational, like that they have to know us, you know, as people that they know and love and care for and see our resources. You know, if, you know, now that's a barrier if you're a trans person and they can't get past your gender nonconformity to even have a relationship with you, obviously. But if they do get to know us and they love us, then I think we can really make change. Just, you know, personally kind of talking to people behind the scenes. So I've been working with my pastor and she's been a lot more receptive and talking about the marginalization of queer and trans people after I, had a talk with her about my own religious trauma. So it was like a personal one-on-one thing with her that's changing what she's doing. And then we're looking at gender inclusive restrooms, and they asked me to be on their vestry. So we get voted in, I think, soon. So if I get voted in, she's asked my help with that. So I think that that's one way that we can educate people with our own relationships. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing.
And now we have Cynthia. We're going to allow Cynthia to talk. All right.
Hi. If you could share, I missed the beginning of the session, so I don't know if you already shared this, but if you could share a little bit about like your personal journey with like being non-binary and such, that'd be interesting.
Yeah. I'm also someone who being in the house during quarantine really prompted my gender exploration. And I think a lot of like being a theology student actually enhanced like me figuring that out about myself, like really learning about a lot of the more like liberation theology ideas in Christian thought, and like the ideas of prioritizing the marginalized, and like reading queer theology really like made me realize that, God loves me exactly as I am. And it made me realize like, oh, maybe I'm not a woman like I thought I was. So for me, theology was really like a pathway to figuring that out about myself. I know that it can just as easily be a weapon that's used against people. And I've had that experience as well, being a theology student and being queer. But like, yeah, I think it was ultimately like, and I've been involved in Q Christian for a little while now. I think being in these like community groups and participating in conference really like allowed me to accept that about myself as well.
Do you have any books? Wait, can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Do you have any books that you recommend for someone who's like starting on that journey?
That's a great question. I would honestly suggest I can send you the name of the hero article that I read, which is basically like about like how being a trans person made him closer to God. So I'm gonna put the name of that article in the chat. I think that really opened my eyes. And then I think like a lot of people who are participating in conference, actually, like I read Beyond Shame, I read Bad Theology Kills, like a lot of books by the keynote speakers at Q conference have been really educational for me as well.
So Beyond Shame, what was the other one?
Bad Theology Kills.
All right. So we have 10 minutes left. I want to address Jill Whitney next, and then we also have a question from Grace Thomas in the Q&A. So Jill, you are ready.
Okay. I have come to the point where I'm interested in this conversation because I have a 15-year-old transgender son. And a lot of what you said, Sarah, about the speaking to the marginalized in this conversation has really been something that I've come to kind of has made my heart hurt for the LGBTQ community. And just how I'm trying to get, my church to see that, because it's just kind of a topic that seems like it's uncomfortable. So people just don't want to talk about it. So they just avoid it. And with my child coming out, they're still somewhat trying to avoid it, but it's making it a lot harder because they are involved in the youth group, and it's forcing the youth leaders and the church leaders. I don't go to a terribly large church to kind of wrestle with these issues, and they're kind of side B at this point, but just trying to, get them to see what their actions and their view of the LGBTQ community, which really hasn't even been in the church. They just, like you said, have, oh, there's LGBTQ Christians, like they exist. And the more I'm kind of diving into this, the more I'm realizing they're out there and they are scared to kind of make themselves known. And there's parents within my own church that are scared to talk about their own kids. And so, yeah, the whole marginalized conversation was just really a way that I'm hoping can get some of my church and other Christians to kind of see how we are marginalizing the LGBTQ community, and that is not a Christian way of approaching people, and that people are created in the image of God, and He created us in the womb, and that creation of God knowing exactly how they were created. I mean, He doesn't make mistakes, so that part of their identity can't be a mistake either. So, just my thoughts I wanted to share. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing.
So Grace's question. I am trans and had never heard the term transgender until after I was willing to admit internally that I wasn't male at the age of 61. I am 66 now. It occurs to me that I don't really have a theology that provides a place for me. What are the broad strokes of such a theology?
Yeah, I think queer theology is extremely broad and diverse in its approaches, but I think ultimately it's just trying to interrogate anything that's rigid in Christian theology and to question anything that seems binary in Christian thought, and trying to add some more nuance and space in that conversation, which is basically what I tried to do with this presentation, is to add more nuance to the binary, I would say, is a lot of what queer theology is. But yeah, there's a lot of different perspectives from different scholars on what that would be as well. That's just my take.
Thank you. Any other questions, final thoughts before we adjourn? All right. Well, everybody, if I can please ask you to do so, please put your thanks in the chat for Sarah and for everyone who raised their voices today. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I hope you have a great rest of conference.